want to welcome everyone to the University Interdisciplinary Colloquium for the 2nd of October. We're very pleased to have you join us today. The University Interdisciplinary Colloquium, or the UIC as we call it, is organized by the Michigan State University Center for Interdisciplinarity, and it's sponsored by the College of Arts and Letters at MSU. The UIC highlights innovative and important interdisciplinary work that involves artistic or humanistic perspectives. And this is work that's done by investigators at Michigan State University. Interdisciplinarity is kind of a buzzword and has been for a while. At major research universities, often it's a buzzword that functions as kind of code for well-funded complex science. But some of the best and most influential interdisciplinary work from our perspective, reflects an appreciation for the aesthetic and humanistic dimensions of human experience, broadly construed. The UIC is an attempt really to acknowledge and amplify interdisciplinary contributions that feature these elements, that highlight the human at the center of these complex problems that so interest us right now. We meet every other week during the fall and the spring semester. So we meet today and then in 2 weeks from today and so forth. And this year, at least the fall slate will be on Zoom. Probably all of our sessions will be on Zoom. So if you enjoy the session today, we encourage you to keep coming back. We'd love to have you be a participant in our future sessions. The next one will be, as I said, in 2 weeks on the 16th of October, same time, 12 to 1 on Zoom. The presenter will be Caitlin Torfey. She is lead researcher and founder of the Teachers and Social Media Project here at Michigan State. She'll deliver a presentation entitled Educational Professionalism Within the Fifth Estate, Networks of Influence Within Social Media and Education. So that's in 2 weeks. Today, we're really pleased, finally, to have Professor Krista Isaacs with us delivering a presentation. Professor Isaacs was scheduled to deliver, I think, the next presentation after the pandemic hit in March. So we unfortunately had to cancel it at that time, but fortunately, we were able to bring her back in and put her on the slate for the fall. Professor Isaacs is Assistant Professor of International Seed Systems in the Department of Plant, Soil, and Microbial Sciences at Michigan State University. She is an agroecologist who approaches participatory research with smallholder farmers from both social and ecological dimensions. After receiving a bachelor's in sociology from the University of Montana, she was a Peace Corps volunteer in Paraguay, which helped her realize the myriad of social, cultural, political, and agroecological factors that impact farmers' decisions and livelihoods. Professor Isaacs attended Cornell University, where she received a master's in international agriculture for research on the linkages between agriculture and nutrition in the highlands of Bolivia. With various ventures in between, she went on to get a PhD from Michigan State University in crop and soil sciences. She was a Fulbright Fellow in Rwanda and studied farmer knowledge about bean traits for intercropping systems. As a postdoc, she lived in Mali and worked with plant breeders and seed cooperatives on women's trait preferences and barriers to adoption of new varieties. Today, Professor Isaacs is with us to deliver a talk entitled Brokering Power and Access, Case Studies of Gender and Seed Systems. Professor Isaacs.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the nice introduction. It's a pleasure to finally be here, and thanks again for everyone who's joining on yet another Zoom talk. So today, let me share my screen, I guess. So today I'm going to be talking to you about one case actually in Uttar Pradesh, India, that focuses on brokering power and access by combining gender and seed systems research. So I want to start off talking about a little bit about transdisciplinarity. My research kind of crosses these often siloed disciplines of agronomy, plant breeding, ecology, gender studies, participatory action research, seed systems, and sometimes human nutrition. And when I first met Michael O'Rourke at a MSU event almost 3 years ago, I described myself as someone that does transdisciplinary research. And he asked me how I do transdisciplinary research. And of course, he was asking me this because he's done some great work, including the toolbox that they have on interdisciplinary research. And I didn't have an answer for him. I was like, how do I do it? And what are my methods? And I realized in a lot of ways that this transdisciplinarity is in my head. All of these disciplines that I have some degree of expertise in are floating around together, and they come from a place of trying to understand the context, no matter where I am. And I'm a listener, and from this place of listening, I have learned that everything under the iceberg matters. And when I'm talking about iceberg, you probably are familiar with the cultural theory, the iceberg cultural theory, where there's the things that we see about people or a person or groups of people or communities on the surface. And then there's all the underlying pieces that we're not really familiar with. And, you know, harking back to the Titanic, that historical travesty was partially because they were only seeing what's on top of the water surface rather than all of the things that are underlying, or the iceberg that was underlying it. And it led to a lot of deaths. And so what's underlying these different places, the context in these different places, is really important to understand. And my interest in these different disciplines comes from a place of working with smallholder farmers whose worldview is quite different than the one that I've grown up with, but that really thinks about all of the different pieces that come together, both the socio, ecological, political, and ecological factors, and how those things come together in the decisions that they make on their farms. So one of the questions that I want to ask today is, can we ever really know what is the less visible part? And how do we build programs in agriculture research and development that are driven from within so that we can respect these differences? And I would argue that one of the challenges in agriculture research, or one of the problems in agriculture research and development, is that a lot of the technologies that are developed for other places often fail to understand or value the context and the intersectionalities that are found in that iceberg below the surface. So what happens when these things are actually considered, or when we give the power, we relinquish our position as academics or NGO program managers or whatever it is, and enable communities and other groups to direct their path? And yeah, so what do we learn, and what is gained when we consider or enable the consideration of all of these different factors? So today I'm going to talk about this case study in India, and I want to give you a little bit of background material so that you can understand some of the data that was collected. The first is some of the historical issues in gender and agriculture research, and then what the heck seed systems are and how they function. So I'll try to go through those fairly briefly. And then I will also present some of the information from self-help groups and the data that we collected on seed production and women's sense of empowerment in this case study. So gender in international agriculture and research and development has undergone a lot of changes. It's rooted, gender started becoming something in ag and research development maybe in the 80s, and it's gone through a lot of iterations. It still tends to be applied onto the top of our proposals rather than being the foundation and an underlying consideration when we're thinking about working in different communities or for whatever end goal. But mainstream agriculture and development have often argued that agriculture technologies, which could be varieties or different tools that are used, contribute to poverty alleviation and the empowerment of poor people in agriculture. But we have a lot of evidence that these technologies actually don't lead to structural improvements in women's livelihoods. And particularly ag and development focuses on economic empowerment. So ensuring that women in a household or marginalized members in a household have a way to make income, or that maybe they're growing a crop that can now be marketed. But what we find is that economic empowerment doesn't always lead to social or structural changes in the household and their livelihood. And you know, a lot of times when a crop becomes more profitable, it actually switches over to in the control or in the domain of men. And so, well, a lot of gender and ag still focuses on these economic ways of empowering women. The social and institutional power structures in our society, so the relationships we have in our households, the ways in society also reinforce the inequalities that hinder social development. And so until we can actually address some of those social and institutional power structures, perhaps economic empowerment isn't going to be as effective as donors and NGOs would like to think. So there's a lot of ways of thinking about empowerment. There's a huge breadth of literature on it. And for the sake of simplicity, I want to focus on Rowland's the way that she outlined empowerment in a great book from 1997, Questioning Empowerment. And she lays out into three different, and a lot of authors do, but into three different ways of thinking about empowerment. And the first one is personal. So developing a sense of self and individual confidence and capacity, and undoing the effects of internalized oppression. So really, one, this is like realizing your self-worth and confidence and your abilities, but also undoing the effect of whatever those social and household and political institutional factors that are actually oppressing you, like understanding what those are. There's the relational dimension of empowerment, which is developing the ability to negotiate and influence the nature of a relationship and decisions made within it. And then there's also collective empowerment, where individuals work together to achieve a more extensive impact than each would have had alone. And so these are different levels of empowerment and ways that, these are different levels. So I've worked extensively on this project with Dr. Walter DeBoeuf, who is a seed system specialist and currently at Wageningen. And he brought me in 2017. And the premise of the paper or some of the work that I'm presenting is based on these hypotheses, or our ways of thinking about how seed systems embedded in a social network has how that influences women's empowerment. So the first is that social organization, or basically the collective, is also an empowerment process for women, and it creates the conditions for genetic gain to be effective. I'll talk a little bit more about what I mean by genetic gain in a few slides. And then social organization and networks create the preconditions necessary for economic empowerment. So like I just said, if we can change or influence some of these personal and relational and institutional factors that prevent people from gaining from economic gains, that sounded funny, but then maybe through that, through those change, they can actually achieve true economic empowerment. So I'd just like to say, like, I can't see the chat box right now. So if there's for some reason someone needs to interrupt me, please just yell, because I can't see it. But I'm happy to field questions now or at the end. So this is a brief background on seed systems, which is the main area that I work in. And if you take nothing away from this talk about seed systems, in the next few slides, at least this is the important part that you need to know. So basic seed systems function to ensure farmers have seed that is of high quality, so it germinates quickly and it has high vigor. It's true to type, whatever that type is desired. It's high yielding and disease resistant. It's adapted to the growing conditions of the farmer, and it meets their needs for the intended end use of the crop. So it's whether that's food, fiber, marketing, or there's a lot of seeds and different crops that are important in cultural ceremonies and things like that. So these are things that seed systems provide for, and there's a lot of different ways that seed get to farmers, which I'll talk about in a moment. But so this basic seed system function is that it needs to be that seed and the varieties that farmers use is appropriate for the agroecological system. So that means if you look at all these different pictures, we have a lot of different types of soil. There's a lot of different types of rainfall systems. And for here, there's an example of highlands in Rwanda. There's a lot of potential for erosion. And this is a irrigation fed urban garden in Mali. And here's a rice field. So each of these different places have different parameters in terms of the soil and ecology and climate. And how well a variety grows in those places is really going to be variable. And so adaptation to that agroecological system is really important and a basic function of the seed system. Adaptation to the socio-cultural system is also a basic function of seed systems. And for example, here in the lower left corner, we have a culinary test looking at different varieties of sorghum, and when they're processed into a traditional food, they come out in different colors, they have different textures, and they have different tastes. And if that variety that's been developed by plant breeders doesn't meet the needs of that community, maybe it's a great agronomically, maybe it has a great yield, but it doesn't process well, or there's a lot of lost food wastage in bran or something like that, then it's not going to be adopted and it's not going to meet the needs of that community. So having a seed system that actually considers the needs of different groups, no matter where they are, whether they're in marginal environments or they're in large commercial farming, is really important to make sure that those varieties meet those needs. And the seed system supplies them to them. And this is, again, another case of that iceberg. It's really hard to figure out some of all these other cultural issues underlying what makes a good crop variety and something that farmers want to grow. And a lot of the times in ag and development and breeding, breeders are focusing more on what's above the surface and getting a high yield, but not necessarily considering these things, even though it is a basic function of a seed system. So these seed systems need to meet the socio-cultural system. They need to be adapted to the agroecology. And then the more formal system has all these other components of variety development that's based on genetic resources from seed banks or other farmers. There's the seed supply, how it actually gets to farmers, dissemination, crop production, and a legal framework. They're also really pluralistic and complex, and there's different levels. So an informal farmer seed system might be more where farmers are saving their seed from the crop that they grew that year. They select the seed out of the field, they dry it, and they grow it the next year. They might exchange it with their neighbors, and they have, you know, a complex network of understanding what they need and exchanging and developing other types of varieties. There's also the more formal system that goes through a process of breeding, a formal release that requires regulatory laws, or that goes along with laws. There's multiplication of the seed, so increasing the amount of seed so that it actually can be disseminated or distributed. And there's also the marketing. And so in reality, these things overlap in a lot of different ways, and farmers engage with a formal system depending on the crop. So I'll stop there on that one. There's a lot of issues in seed systems. They're complex. Seed companies concentrate on key profitable crops. So other crops that may be more nutritious or might be appropriate for climate change or different things like that may not be receiving the attention they need to have better yield and be appropriate for some of these systems. Policies that drive seed regulation, variety development, and availability are based on the voices that are heard. And so it depends who breeders talk to and what they're hearing and how much they're choosing to look at the underlying factors in that iceberg. Crop diversity is often neglected by conventional agriculture. Seed for marginal farming systems are neglected by policy and often plant breeders. So women farmers often have low quality fields in terms of the soil, or they may be, or households that are growing intercropping systems are really far from service centers, are completely underserved by seed systems, formal seed systems. And importantly, access to this seed and availability of quality seed with new varieties that has better yield potential and disease resistant is really low. So now shifting our focus to this case study in Uttar Pradesh. This research and program is in Uttar Pradesh, up here in the northern part of India, and rice and wheat are some of the major crops grown in the area. It's one of the poorest regions in India with some of the highest rates of violence against women. And it's also home to an incredible wealth of beautiful people and places. The Rajiv Gandhi Mahila Vikas Pariyojana nonprofit institution is part of the Rajiv Gandhi Charitable Trust Foundation, and they work with millions of women to address power dynamics in hierarchical social systems that perpetuate poverty. They do this by addressing three different things: institutional building. So they want to unite women in self-help groups in order to collectively break barriers and plan for their futures. And one of their main strategies is microcredit savings. They do capacity building. So they strengthen the women in these SHG groups through helping them learn to manage things by doing health and hygiene, different learning and trainings and things like that. And then they also have all these field programs that link self-help group members and their families to existing structures of services and delivery. For example, learning how to use a bank, or being able to talk to an extension officer, or different things like that. These self-help groups, as I mentioned, are micro saving groups. So they're 8 to 20 women from the same neighborhood that come together, or they recruit each other to do incredibly micro savings. So, like 10 cents a week or something like that, in order to build a corpus so that they can make loans to each other. And eventually they save enough money so that they can open a bank account. And then once they have enough in the bank account, they can actually take out loans from the bank. And so as a collective unit, they're able to have access to money that they never had access to before. And they use it to buy a cow. And then from that milk, they sell the milk and pay back the self-help group. And so on a cycle ongoing like that. So they pay for education for their children. They pay for shops. Like this woman, she was so proud of her shop that she was able to open because of the support from the SHG. So these self-help groups are embedded inside of the village organization, which is made up of many different self-help groups, and there's leadership and support there. And then there's also this block level organization that's there's maybe 20 or 30 blocks within a district. And so this three-tier system is a platform for collective action and mutual help and entitlements. And so they support each other. This three-tier system has grown. Our GMVP started working there in 2002. In 2007, they were working with 56,000 women and about 5,000 self-help groups. By 2018, they were working with 2 million women and 175,000 self-help groups. So there's a lot of potential in these groups. A lot of growth, a lot of reach to a lot of different communities all over the region. So on top of this three-tiered system that was reaching so many million or thousands of women, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation brought in a seed project that was led by Dr. Walter DeBoeuf at the time. And he's the one, as I mentioned earlier, that brought me into this research. And the seed project was basically another way. The idea was in order to improve women's access and farm families' access to quality seed. So before the seed project came in, how were women from the SHGs engaged in the seed system? They were not. Women were often involved in production, so they were basically labor in the fields. They would plant seed or rice paddy and things like that, but they had no role in any of those parts of the seed system. Grain, not seed, so grain is not necessarily intended for growing for seed and doesn't have some of the genetic potential that seed does. It was previously bought at the market by men. People didn't know different quality or varieties, which is surprising for me, having worked with a lot of rural communities. They have a great sense of different varieties and their names and things like that, but a lot of that knowledge had been lost in this area. Yield was very low, and women were not involved in seed purchase, and women were only key in labor. So this project brought in a few different things. At first, it started working on women and building skills and agricultural techniques. And it was really focused on more ecological ways of production. So women learned how to make compost teas and to make these amazing compost pancakes that weren't actually too hard to do because they all tend to have these hand cranked machines that break the residues down very small. So it composts very quickly in 7 days. A key component of this seed project was participatory variety selection. And PVS is a way to get varieties that have been developed by public or private plant breeders and institutions out into the field and onto farmers' fields that often have different conditions than the research station where they were developed. And so through this three-tier system in our GMVP, they accessed seed from universities and brought them out to farmers' fields and tested them, and then the women evaluated them blindly. And this is how they identified the varieties that they wanted this is how they developed they identified the varieties that they wanted to use for producing seed. These varieties these would be huge events, and then other people walking through the community would also see these fields with all these different varieties. These varieties were used for seed production by the women, and then eventually non-seed producers in SHGs and community members purchased the seed. So not only were people in the SHG purchasing seed, but so were people outside of it. So I should note that within an SHG, there might have been 1 or 2 women that were selected to be the seed producer. And that composting often was used to improve the soil fertility of the field, specifically for seed production. They also learned about using natural pesticides, especially neem, about roguing, which is taking out off types when you're growing for seed. You need to get rid of all the ones that don't look like the seed, so you can the one that you want, so you're keeping it true to type. Cleaning, sorting, and packaging, and they also were very much involved in seed quality and testing. So the women learned how to do germination rates and things like that in order to know how well their seed was germinating in its quality. So hundreds of women began producing wheat and rice seed and marketing it through this 3-tier structure. So what about women's empowerment? This is what I came to talk to you about. So our questions were, how has participation in SHG seed production activities affected women's sense of empowerment? And what has happened with household relations? So I did a series of visits to India, over maybe 4 different visits, that was really about reviewing documents and processes and building in ways to make this program more sustainable over time. But we also did data collection with a pile sort that looked at gender issues related to activities and responsibilities and decision making. And then I did a lot of in-depth interviews. So in the pile sort, we talked to men and women that were not in self-help groups, women that were in self-help groups, and then men and women that were in self-help groups and were also seed producers. I should say that the RGMVP purposely started this seed project in communities and SHGs that had been established for a long time. So they were purposely building on the collective strength of the SHG that had been built over time in order to bring in these seed projects. We also did 36 interviews with SHG members and then seed producers as well, to try to understand differences in empowerment between people that were in the SHG and people that were in also seed producers in the SHG, and see if there were changes there. I just want to point out here in this picture is Sarah Saad and Samart Singh. Samart Singh is the program manager for the seed project at RGMVP, and Sarah Sada was my translator. And they were both instrumental in making RGMVP's activities possible and making my research there possible. This is an example of one of the pile sorts. So we would start out with all of these green labels are different different activities that people were doing in the household, and we would ask who did them. And then we would ask them in the second series on that picture on the right about equity. So you can see in this first picture that the women are doing a lot of activities related to the farm, related to the household, and men are also have a fair amount of responsibilities. There are very few that are shared. And a lot of times when women said that they had a lot of activities in the household and the men did not, they said that it was because the men were working outside of the home, and so they needed to do those activities. when we ask questions about, well, is this equitable, and does this make sense, or what do you think about this, or what would you like to see, some of these things shifted. Some of the women's roles and activities moved over to being joint decisions. Joint activities. But so did some of the men's become joint activities. Here's another example of women doing a lot of the work and the men having fewer activities. Related specifically to seed, we found that non-SHG members, the men buy grain for seed. Like we said, SHG members purchase seed from the SHG network or directly from a producer in the village. So they're actually using seed and they're getting it locally. And then seed producers, of course, are producing their own seed. We also looked at decision making, and to be brief about this, we saw that in a lot of cases that men are making the majority of the decisions, women barely have any say on anything, and then there's some things that are mutual decisions related to child health or maybe education and different things like that. And then when we asked about the equity of this, some things do shift, and some of the important ones that shift are that women have more say in whether or not they can leave the house. So previously, they often were stayed in the house, weren't allowed to leave, and absolutely had to ask permission. I'm going a little fast here because I know we're getting a little short on time. But so those pile sort activities were, they also depended on who we were talking to, if we were talking to men or women, and the experience of the group. So people that had been in the seed production, they started out with having a lot more decision making. The women were making decisions on the farm. And then things started shifting towards having mutual decision making. And there were cases of women never having any decision-making power. And I remember one woman, like she said, we do everything together and we always have. And it was the only time I heard that in the whole time I've been there. But anyway, so I'm mixing together pile sort and interview data and some other documentation that we have on numbers to give you a picture of this. Prior to the SHG, women rarely left the home. So this woman was talking about, for the SHG, she got to leave and organize meetings, and her family really had an issue with this, but it also triggered her interest in agriculture and seed production. So through this project, the number of women active in seed production changed over time. So at the beginning, you see this blue line up here with the wheat. There were almost 900 women that were engaged in wheat seed production in 2016, but only about 450 or 500 of them were actually successful. And this gap narrows over time. So there was a lot of challenges associated with producing seed, and finding the equilibrium of production was important. So one woman, for example, it took her a whole year to make her land really fertile, and then she was able to start producing seed. The SHGs would also come, and the members would come and inspect the fields to make sure that they were meeting the requirements of the seed. There's a lot of issues with limited land area and insufficient resources to be a seed producer. So there's only, there's a lot of women becoming seed producers, but it's not the best situation for all of them. The seed was marketed through the three-tier system. So you can see here the change in the amount of wheat that was produced, which is on the wheat side, the blue bar, and on the red is the amount marketed. So through just over the 2.5 years of the project, there was an increase in the amount of seed produced by these women and actually marketed. Women talked about selling their seed to the block members and SHG groups. well, SHGs, and also to members in other groups. And this woman was talking about arranging her fields so that they were really nice. She lived at a cross section, and so people could come and see it, and they would ask about it. And so she was selling outside of the SHG already. We looked at the estimated number of farmers using wheat and rice seed produced by SHG members, so that also increased. On the left, we have the wheat seed axis, and on the right is the rice, which is the pink bar. Sorry, it's the green bar. And so the amount of farmers that were using wheat and rice seed produced by the SHG seed producers increased substantially over these few years. This woman was talking about seeing her father was purchasing this really expensive seed, and she said, why don't we try this seed from this SHG, and because it was really cheap. And so they tried it, and now she's become a seed producer because they were so convinced by it. Often the women would do an exchange of seed. Instead of using money, they would do a 1-to-2 ratio for rice, and then a 1-to-3 ratio for wheat. I might have that backwards, but so there was a barter system and an exchange of grain for seed instead of cash, which is really important for low-income farmers. The number of wheat and rice varieties marketed through the VOs also increased. So this is really important. Prior to this study, these farmers were not using known varieties and maybe not even improved varieties. It's not really clear. But now they were using new varieties that had the genetic potential for their growing conditions. And so there was an increase in the number of varieties accessible to people and the quality of those seed. This woman was also talking about selling beyond the 3-tier system. She said that people would come back to buy her seed, and they would click pictures of their crops and they would show it to her. She said, I feel happy to see the quality of crops because of my seeds only, crops are growing bigger. And another person came to buy the seed. He couldn't find the seed anywhere else because her seed didn't have chemical fertilizers or urea. He actually wanted more seed, and she didn't have it, and that gave her the idea to produce even more seed. So with that brief snapshot of some of the things we found, we can ask the question, how are women engaged in the seed system? And while they may not be engaged in this more formal section about with breeding and release, they are certainly selecting seed and selecting varieties and evaluating it. They're producing seed, they're multiplying that seed, they're disseminating it to their neighbors, to their families, and beyond the organization, the collectives that they work in, and they're marketing it. So they've had an incredible, just in the 3 years of this project, they're much more engaged in the seed system than they ever were. They have appropriated major components of it. And while they are not engaged in more of the breeding and genetic resources, there's incredible potential for plant breeders at the public and private sector to work with these groups to understand the varieties that they need and to have feedback loops in terms of information and getting varieties out for testing and multiplication. It's a pretty interesting model for multiplying seed and making them accessible to a much larger area than traditional companies can get to. So there is a lot of evidence from the research as well on changes in self-worth. One woman said, it's quite emotional for me, as earlier I didn't have anything, but now I am self-sufficient. I am proud of myself. This woman said her family members help her do the lines in the field, and it feels really good that they use the same techniques that she learned, and it has to increase respect for each other because my father works hard on the field, so when I help him, it feels nice as he gets my support. So not only has it's changed their relationships in the household, and a really powerful one that I kept hearing over and over again was people know my name. People come to my house asking for seed. My father says my name and he says I'm a seed producer. And well, I poo-pooed this comment at first because I didn't want to be seen as someone special. They said, you are here talking to me and you know my name because I'm a seed producer. So they were valuing being known from someone far away, and that they were actually they were recognizable as an important person. There was also a lot of evidence for shifts in knowledge and respect and decision making. One woman said her husband used to go to seeds and get this seeds in bulk, and they didn't check the quality. However, we now check that quality before bringing and purchasing them. We know better about agriculture. And one woman said her father-in-law asks her about new varieties, and it makes her feel important. And they make a lot of decisions and give advice within the family about agriculture. They've also learned to use services that they never used. This woman talked about going to the bank and being able to withdraw money, something she never knew how to do. She helps other people do it and she gets money for them too. And and she's taught other people how to do it. The last one point I want to make is that back to our icebergs, this field note was really powerful to me. I was talking to a woman in the SHG, and she talked about how being in the SHG made her realize that there were no differences in castes. And as you know, in India, there's quite a stringent caste system, and people in lower classes wouldn't necessarily even come into someone's house of an upper class. And one of the SHG members said to her, Didi, how can we be together in unity if you cannot drink water in my home? This really impacted her, and over time, she has realized this woman was right. And she now invites all into her home, and they all drink from the same cup. And I just want to point out and bring it back to the iceberg that on the surface, we are things and things that are visible, whether that's caste or race or age or whatever on the surface. But what's underlying all of us is that we have similar needs and a similar human capacity for love and sharing and learning together. So in conclusion, membership in SHGs contributed to a change in the women's collective perceptions of themselves. They appropriated several components of the seed value chain. And being able to produce high quality seed and be knowledgeable about agriculture contributed to a change in the household because they had knowledge, they had earning potential, and this brokered a shift in household relations and structure. They also started having relations beyond the household, in the market, the community, and beyond. Importantly here, our GMVP is driven primarily by an intrinsic purpose, that is to empower women and break social hierarchies, but its development actions were related to self and health and savings and hygiene, which are very much an instrumental approach to empowerment. The SEED project was also primarily driven by an instrumental purpose, that is to increase access to and use of quality seed of improved varieties. But what I find the thing that I take away from this is that while the SEED project was originally driven by instrumental empowerment, it contributed in intrinsic form to women's empowerment. So in having this incredible network that was about women's collective power and putting a more instrumental seed system approach on top of that enabled these women to gain both knowledge and another level of economic empowerment. And through that knowledge that they had and their ability to support the family contributed to their sense of self-wealth and relations in their family. So I'd like to acknowledge the people that our GMVP and the incredible work that they've done, and all of the program officers that I already mentioned. Dr. Walter DeBoeuf has been a mentor for me, and it's been really incredible working together on this. And one of the papers that's presented in here is in review. And this funding was from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And importantly, all of the SHG members and individuals in Raebareli and Amithi that took the time to talk to me and engage with me and tell me about their experiences. I appreciate them. Thanks, and sorry about the time.
Great, thank you very much, Krista. We have time for questions. If people would, if you have a question, if you could drop it in the chat or in the Q&A box. We have a question from Sig Snap, and I'll read it. It is very moving to see this type of change in women's self-worth and community relationships. Did you gain a sense of male views of the shifts in relationships? Any backlash or positive feedbacks?
Yeah, thanks, Sig. That's a great question. There was a sense of male views of the shift, especially with the seed producers. When we talked in those pile sorts and within the pile sorts, they were proud of the women, and they were happy that there was some more balance in the family. I can't say there was certainly pushback, and especially there was pushback, before I was involved in the SHGs, and women really struggled to be able even to join the SHGs. But once they were contributing, not just the economic part, because that could be taken away from them, and the men kind of controlled that. But when they had some more knowledge that the men didn't have, there was a whole nother level of respect that started. And so not all the data is analyzed, but yeah, there's definitely some evidence of them valuing the change as well.
Great. Let's see. Are there other questions? If not, I have one. Please, again, if you have any thoughts or questions, we'd love to have you provide them. Krista, I'm curious about the theory of change that the RG MVP, is that right? RG MVP uses, and that one of the elements of it involved institution building. Mm-hmm. And I guess the question I had was kind of related to SIG's, I think, in the sense that culture change of the sort that you're helping to affect is likely to have all sorts of implications and consequences at the local level, but also at regional and even national levels. And I'm curious about these bigger scale contexts, and maybe I'm thinking that the institution building aspect of the theory of change is like focused maybe a little bit on the bigger scale contexts within which this culture change is taking place. And I'm kind of wondering, please tell me if I'm on the wrong track there, but if that's right, maybe if you could just say a bit more about what the institution building kind of strategies were that RG MVP uses.
Mm-hmm. So I think in their theory of change, there's, of course, at the individual level, but through this collective and these different hierarchies, which maybe they wouldn't like to say, but like these larger scales of institutions that are supporting women. But yeah, the underlying idea is to change institutions from within. And your question is like,
I'm just imagining, for instance, I wasn't very clear, but just imagining these local changes, for them to be stable and kind of persistent, it seems to me that you'd also need to ensure that the context within which those local changes take place are conducive to their stability.
Right.
And if there's conflict across the scales, then that's likely going to have, I would imagine, a negative effect on, on the persistence of this kind of culture change.
Right. So I guess, so one of the ways that they were trying to create some more long-term structure here is through a lot of, like, the women in the self-help groups became the leaders or became the trainers in other communities. And then there were also, through RGMPP, their agriculture officers were actually all men. Not necessarily by design, but, well, maybe it was, I don't know. But so those men were also really engaged with these women and supporting them in these activities. And they were learning about these gender dynamics and things like that. So I think there were a lot of people involved also that have gained a lot of skills and capacity in understanding some of these structural issues. But one of the challenges that we faced is that the funding was cut very quickly because of political reasons between the India and Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. What we were working on is trying to build in more sustainability or long-term ways of these women being able to do these things. And so by connecting, working with people at the block level to actually reach out to universities to get new varieties, or being able to have savings accounts and a corpus from selling their varieties in order to, get other supplies and things like that. So like trying to build in this structure capacity over the long term, but like, trying to break down some of the hierarchies, like maybe in a research institute that's like, why are we talking to smallholder farmers about new varieties and and those types of things? That wasn't there. Yeah.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Yeah.
I think we've come to an end today. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us. And thank you, Professor Isaacs, for the very interesting and wonderful talk. We really appreciate that you're contributing to the series. We hope that we have a chance to see everyone in 2 weeks. And until then, I hope everyone has a really productive and wonderful time.